So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to be looking at one of Jesus' parables out of Matthew chapter 18. The last few weeks, we've kind of looked at calling and responsibility. I guess this one connects mostly in it's yet another thing I'm bad at spiritually. So, how's that? We'll go with the theme these next few weeks of spiritual things that Colin is bad at. Um, so, the section I'm going to read gets started when Peter is having a conversation with Jesus about forgiveness. But the way Matthew organizes his book is he's kind of got these big blocks of teaching, most of which have some kind of a theme. So obviously the Sermon on the Mount is probably the most famous. It's a big block about what the kingdom is, what the values are, what it looks like to actually live in the kingdom. This section is a smaller one that's focusing from a lot of different angles, but on one basic idea, and that is, what does it mean to be great? What is it that God values? And so this conversation, the bigger one, starts in chapter 18 with just a couple verses here. And so I think to really hear and understand what we're talking about in this conversation between Peter and Jesus, we need to know kind of the overall theme of this section. And so we read in chapter 18, starting in verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then he called a little child over to sit among the disciples and said, "I assure you, if you don't turn your lives around and become like this little child, you will definitely not enter the kingdom of heaven. Those who humble themselves like this little child will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So, this idea of greatness does not have to do with, I think, worthiness in the world's eyes, but with the ability to receive and be humble and be simple and unimpressive. Is going to be an important theme for how Jesus approaches and teaches forgiveness. And I was looking at this passage, and there was kind of a funny comment in one of the books I was reading about it, where they just basically said, we all owe one to Peter for his ability to put his foot in his mouth, to say something stupid that most of us were thinking, or most of us wouldn't even admit to ourselves that we were thinking. And yet Jesus has offered immense amounts of wisdom to us because Peter kind of has this audacity to put his foot in his mouth again and again and again. So it just made me laugh again. We are yet again in Peter's debt for being the symbol, the representative of all of us, not just the boneheaded disciples in the old days. So I say, when we meet Peter, let's all buy him a drink in heaven, right? Okay, so Peter in verse 21 says, "And then Peter said to Jesus, 'Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or my sister who sins against me? Should I forgive as many as 7 times?' And Jesus said, 'Not just 7 times, but rather as many as 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle accounts, they brought him a servant who owed him 10,000 bags of gold. Because the servant didn't have enough to pay it back, the master ordered that he should be sold, along with his wife and children and everything he had, and that the proceeds should be used as payment. But the servant fell down, kneeled before him, and said, 'Please be patient with me, I'll pay you back.' The master had compassion on his servant, released him, and forgave the loan. When that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 coins. He grabbed him by the throat and said, 'Pay me back what you owe me.' Then his fellow servant fell down and begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I'll pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he threw him into prison until he paid back his debt. When his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were deeply offended. They came and told their master what had happened. And his master called the first servant and said, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you appealed to me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?' His master was furious and handed him over to the guard responsible for punishing prisoners until he had paid the whole debt. My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if you don't forgive your brother or sister from your heart." Okay, so a little more kind of biblical context on this story. So the idea of forgiveness had largely been solved by kind of rabbinic teachers in their day. And so they looked at this, they tried to figure out, practically what does it mean to forgive someone? Again, hoping to quantify it, but also helping to kind of limit harm, right? So someone isn't endlessly being taken advantage of. And they had all come to the conclusion that, it was the good spiritual thing to do was forgive someone 3 times. And so Peter, I think, is sensing some of the generosity Jesus has in mind, right? Okay, so he says, okay, if the good rabbinic answer, if the kind of common sense answer that most people are going to agree with is 3 times, I'm going to double that number, right? So they say 3, so I say 6, and let's just, add one more for good measure. 7's a good biblical number. There's lots of those in the Old Testament, right? And so I think that Peter has some sense of the generosity involved in the kingdom, right? And I think he thinks he's being very generous, and I think most people in his day would agree with that. And yet Jesus' response isn't just a heightening of it. It's actually kind of it's kind of part of this rabbinic conversation as well, in which they would take sometimes odd biblical texts as kind of a starting off point to get us thinking about it. And so, whereas Peter and the rabbis, the culture around him, and ourselves often want to have kind of a number, right? A principle in mind, kind of this legalese approach. Jesus takes a pretty different approach. And he goes back, he's most likely kind of quoting earlier in book of Genesis chapter 4:24, when this number 77 shows up again, in which Lamech, who is one of the kind of early patriarchs, he quotes saying that Cain has been avenged when something bad happens to him, right? And he says, this man has struck me, and so I have killed him, and I will be avenged 77 times 7. He is a representative in the Old Testament mind of kind of this unlimited revenge. So 7 equals completeness times 77. Basically, Lamech is kind of shown in the Old Testament for the fact that sin is getting very out of hand very quickly, right? Lamech takes this petty wrong against him and says, I can be avenged in any way I want, as many times as I want. I can have complete revenge and full revenge. And so if that is one of the poles, this kind of complete and whole revenge, Jesus is saying the kingdom views on forgiveness is the extreme opposite. Just as there is no limit to Lamech's or sin's revenge, I can always hurt them in any amount I want for that. The kingdom forgiveness is the opposite. It's not a legal version. It's not something you can say, it's how many times, even if you do the math and, 200 and something, 77 times 7, right? That's not the point. If one side is unlimited revenge, I can always hurt them if I need to get back at them. The kingdom says the opposite. I will always forgive them because the reconciliation between two people is too important. And so forgiveness in both kingdom, forgiveness in the Old Testament is, I think, still one of the most controversial points in the Bible. And so just kind of a quick survey of how forgiveness tends to work in the Bible, I think, is important. The Bible seems to think that our default attitude towards forgiveness is Lamech's, right? In most of human history and many places in the world to this day, the answer to being wronged is more or less the blood feud, right? I will hurt you so much that you desire never to hurt me again. I will cause you harm because you have caused me harm. And so in the ancient world, this idea that we hear quoted in the Old Testament and in Chinese philosophy, in many other different kind of philosophical systems, what's sometimes called the lex talionis from the Latin. But this eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, revenge is not this like blood feud, blood guilt system in which I hurt you, you hurt me, I hurt you back, you hurt me back, right? The idea is justice, limitation. If I injure your eye, you only get to injure my eye back. And so I think to start, if the sinful mind is just hurt, back and forth. And then it just comes down to basically power, right? Whoever can do the most harm wins in the end, or at least temporarily. God is often teaching people through a process. And so he, I think, in the Old Testament is taking this kind of more civilized, this more kind of common cultural understanding that unlimited revenge is not the ideal, that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the limitation and don't hurt back worse, is, I think, an intermediary stage in the Old Testament to start the process of getting his people to think differently than this just kind of default in revenge. This idea, I think, culminates in the New Testament in passages like this one, in which I think the goal is obviously not retaliation. When we've been wronged, we just get to get back at them, however, right? But I also don't think it's the eye for the eye, this idea of justice. It's kind of making sure the two sides of the scale balance out and fit. The idea in biblical forgiveness, the idea in biblical kind of being wronged and our approach to it, the goal, though not always possible, is in fact reconciliation, a reestablishing of the relationships between the two parties, in which they are restored to the relationship they had before, which again, in the biblical mind, is ideally that of brother and sister, where we all see each other within humanity as God's children, right? And so I think this goal of full reconciliation is a pretty radical one, which will often cost us in comparison with the way the world. I think the world at its best often wants to do this kind of balancing of ledgers. They want what they call justice. And God, Jesus, in both this teaching and later on, is taking things a step further, saying a reconciliation between people in which the relationship is restored is very important. And so a huge part of this is, of course, this idea of forgiveness that Jesus is talking about here. So let's talk briefly about a few things that I think biblically forgiveness is not. In conversations around forgiveness, we often hear the phrase forgive and forget, right? So first off, that is not a biblical, it's not from the Bible, although people often quote it like it is. The phrase forgive and forget either comes from Shakespeare, the play King Lear, or there's another pretty similar one in Cervantes, in Don Quixote. But again, if this idea, this little proverb, forgive and forget, is coming from Lear and is coming from Don Quixote, both of which are crazy people, I'm not sure that we should be putting it up on the level with Scripture. I think the idea that both of those quotes are kind of trying to get at is the fact that we're not supposed to, when we forgive, we're not supposed to continue to gnaw on it. We're not supposed to let the thing continue to fester in our hearts. And I think that is a biblical principle. But I think kind of blithely saying forgive and forget can be a little problematic, especially when real dense harm has been done. I think similarly, at times, we can think of forgiveness as a purely internal thing, right? And so someone makes us mad, and maybe we just don't like conflict. Maybe we just kind of are going to pretend like it's not okay, and then we tell ourselves, okay, I've forgiven them, it's gone away. They may not even know that they have harmed us. They may not even care for the reconciliation, right? But I think not acknowledging and having that conversation would maybe get us back to the justice point, but I don't think it gets us back to the full reconciliation point that that is the Bible's goal. And I think one of the reasons I feel so stuck on this was just a book that's been very influential on me. Was written by the theologian Miroslav Volf, who grew up in Croatia in the 90s. So he grew up in the environment in which the term ethnic cleansing was invented. And his kind of first calling was to go back into his own kind of part of the world and work toward reconciliation between two groups who had slaughtered each other and done awful things to one another. And so he's thought long and deeply about this, and he says very particularly this idea of forgive and forget, that, okay, we have forgiven for some very deep wrongs, but what he calls, instead of just forget, pretending like things never happened. He says a more helpful way to move towards reconciliation is what he calls right remembering. And he includes two kind of important pieces in this idea of right remembering. The first is kind of a reflection upon an understanding of how we got to this place, right? Almost never does something as awful as this ethnic cleansing that he experienced come out of a void. There was some fighting back and forth. There was, I hit you, you hit me. There was conversation. There was ways of talking about people. He points out the disdain for people that are not like them, and how this is given time to fester and grow into the hatred that turns into violence eventually. He says not acknowledging that process, not understanding that process, and watching for early warning signs, it means we are not remembering correctly. We're just pretending things didn't happen, which means we're responsible when they happen again. Another piece of right remembering is just recognizing sinful, fallen humanity at times is going to require structures. You cannot simply throw people who have hurt each other as deeply as that back into the same room and pretend like nothing has gone wrong. Violence will erupt again. You're in fact setting up both parties to fall. That is not reconciliation again. And yet he argues very persuasively for this long, painful process in which people do figure out what happened and the ways that they have hurt one another, and if it is possible to move forward and heal. But again, he keeps saying the goal is not to make things fair and even again. The goal is to get to the point where we are reconciled, where we see each other as brother and sister. And he ends with the image of embrace, saying it may not always be possible, but the goal of this process is to get back to the place where we trust one another to the point we can, in fact, open our arms, right? A hug means opening our arms, letting down our defenses, so another person could actually harm us again. We trust them to the point that they can. And so I think a lot of this thinking is what is lurking behind what Jesus is saying. Obviously, this has been deeply reflected on, and it catches us off guard. It still feels very counterintuitive. And I think that is the reason, in the bigger context of this conversation on greatness, and why Jesus' response, and okay, we're not doing Lamech, we're doing the other version, right? We are going to offer unlimited forgiveness. And then he offers this story, again, parables to help us understand and think about it differently, to teach us how this is actually possible, because I don't think true reconciliation between people, especially those who have deeply harmed one another, as we see often in the world, is possible without God's help and without God's gift. And so Jesus offers in the parable a starting point, right? He says, okay, now if you want to talk about someone who has been deeply wronged and deeply hurt by embracing and loving another, you're talking about God. God understands what it is like to love humanity. We continue to harm him daily. We continue to harm his beloved children and one another. Jesus will ultimately end on a cross embracing all sin and death and pain that he did not deserve for our sake to bring about this healing, right? God gets pain. God gets the debt that we owe. God has shown us incredible forgiveness. And if that is our baseline, recognizing what we have received, it puts us in a very different place than feeling high and mighty, of feeling like we are owed something by someone else first before we can forgive them. We recognize whether we have been wrong in the situation with someone else. When we are wronged, we have yet received an incredible gift, in that we have wronged God far more than they can potentially or ever harm us. And so we pass on some of that grace. We pass on some of that goodness. And I think why this section is so important to embed in, again, that description of the child, the powerless one, the one who is good at receiving, right? We want to tend to earn things. We still approach God that way. And yet, I think forgiveness is a very strong indication. This is the goal: unlimited forgiveness, reconciliation with the other, including our enemies, those who have hurt us. I don't think we are capable of doing this without God's help. And that's why it shows up in this. Just as we have received grace from God, just as we continue to receive God's understanding and love as children do. Children don't sit down on their birthday and wonder, do I deserve this gift? Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I didn't, right? They're just happy to receive. That is the attitude I think we need to have towards God. And we especially need to have this attitude towards forgiveness in others. And so I think we are taught, of course, that this is something we extend to others. And there's this kind of scary image that it ends on of we are not going to receive that gift of forgiveness from God if we cannot offer that to others. And I don't think that that's an image of trying harder. Someone pointed out it's more like breathing, right? When I breathe in, when my lungs are full of carbon dioxide, monoxide, whichever it is, I think it's dioxide, I cannot take in life-breathing oxygen, right? My unforgiveness of another has to leave my lungs before I can breathe in the gift of the forgiveness from God that I'm going to receive. So they're not perfect metaphors, but there's a reason God wants us to start by looking at Him when we're involved in forgiveness and recognizing what we have received and passing that on, which then allows us to, again, receive. So it's a tough chapter in some many ways, but again, recognizing it's in the larger context of receiving goodness from God, receiving forgiveness from God, that we, in our own broken ways, attempt to pass that on, to forgive others, and to be reconciled with anyone in the human race. It's scary, it's hard, but it's not impossible because we have a God who breathes that into us and can empower us and give us the strength to do anything, even something like this that feels impossible.